The 1981 FIA Formula One World Championship was the 32th season of Formula One World Championship for drivers and the 24th Formula One World Championship for manufacturers, which were contested over a 15-race series that commenced on the 15th of March and ended on the 17th of October. The 1981 South African Grand Prix, as a non-championship race due to difficulties from the ongoing FISA-FOCA war, was open to Formula One entrants but was not part of the World Championship. The 1981 championship was the first to be run under the FIA Formula One World Championship name, replacing both the original World Championship of Drivers and International Cup for Constructors. Under the influence of Brabham team owner Bernie Ecclestone and the FOCA organization, teams were asked to sign the first Concord Agreement, which would set Formula One on course to become a profitable business. The agreement required teams to lodge entries for the entire championship rather than individual races, while the FIA would also set the prize money. A standardized set of rules would be in place at every race and, from 1982 on, the entrants had to own the intellectual rights to the chassis that they entered. As such, the distinction between the terms entrant and constructor, and hence also a team, have become less pronounced. Nelson Piquet won the Drivers' Championship, claiming the first of his 3 drivers' titles, while Williams won the Constructors' Championship for the second consecutive year. In this season, Avon and Pirelli entered the sport as tire manufacturers. After the Shadow team had been absorbed into Theodore Racing halfway through the 1980 season, Theodore entered this season with their own chassis and the Shadow name disappeared. In 1980, Ram Racing had raced with a customer Williams chassis, but they did not enter the 1981 season. March Engineering, however, used that chassis to make a return to Formula One. In 1983, Ram would return to take over from March. After finishing 1-2 in the 1980 European Formula 2 Championship, Toleman entered Formula One. Discussions took place with Lancia as possible engine supplier. The team decided to use a turbocharged version of the Hart F2 engine. It made them one of the early adopters on the trend towards turbocharged cars, but their first chassis was overweight and underpowered. Ligier had acquired substantial sponsorship from Talbot and other public French companies. Talbot supplied Matra V12 engines. 1979 world champion Jody Scheckter had retired after last season, while Alain Prost had moved to Renault. There had been a lot of change over the winter. Ligier had lost Didier Pironi to Ferrari, when 1979 world champion Jody Scheckter had retired. They hired Jean-Pierre Jabouille from Renault, but when the season started, he was still recovering from his leg injury sustained in the 1980 Canadian Grand Prix. Jean-Pierre Jorier had left the team, but acted as his stand-in for the first 2 races of the 1981 season. Renault managed to sign Alain Prost, despite his 2-year contract with McLaren, so the British team had to scramble for a new driver. Main sponsor Marlboro suggested Andrea de Cesaris from Alfa Romeo when he had to move for 1978 world champion Mario Andretti. The American had spent 5 years with Lotus. Nigel Mansell was promoted to a full-season drive with the Lotus team. Tyrrell had lost both of its 1980 drivers and so hired Eddie Cheever from Osella and an inexperienced Kevin Cogan, but during the season he did not manage to qualify for the opening race and was sacked by the Tyrrell team. It was Cogan's last F1 outing. He was replaced by Riccardo Zunino, who had spent the first half of 1980 driving for Brabham. After 2 races, however, Zunino was moved aside for sports car driver Michel Alboreto. During the first lap of the San Marino Grand Prix, Osella driver Miguel Angel Guerra was hit by Eliseo Salazar, crashed into a wall and suffered a broken wrist and ankle. Piercarlo Ghinzani made his debut to replace the Argentinian. Later, Giorgio Francia took over for 1 race, and Jean-Pierre Jorier finished the season, looking forward to a full-season drive in 1982. From the Belgian Grand Prix on, Jan Lammers had to give up his seat for Slim Borgard, the drummer for ABBA. There was no cash sponsorship, but the world-famous band's logo on the car's sidepods was a hopeful move by the ATS team to attract other investors. Before the Spanish Grand Prix, Eliseo Salazar moved from March to Ensign, replacing Marc Schurer. The Swiss driver moved to Theodore, from where Patrick Tambay moved to Ligier. Their driver Jean-Pierre Jabouille retired from F1, concluding he could not fully recover from last year's leg injuries. For the last 2 races of the season, Jacques Villeneuve Sr., brother of Gilles and uncle to Jacques Jr., made his F1 debut with Arrows. Their driver Siegfried Stoer was traumatized by the start line accident at the Belgian Grand Prix and decided to retire to start a racing school and safe driving academy. The South African Grand Prix at Kyalami was going to be the season opener on the 7th of February, but difficulties from the ongoing FISA-FOCA war led to the event being run as a non-championship race. It was contested only by the Ford Cosworth-powered teams, all running cars with aerodynamic devices which were banned for the 1981 championship season. The race at Long Beach was the official championship opener after the Argentine and Brazilian Grand Prix had been moved back to March-April. The Brazilian race was also moved from the Interlagos to Jacarepagua due to a long list of safety issues. The Italian Grand Prix was back at Monza after a year's absence. The circuit underwent major upgrades including a new pit building. The Autodromo Dino Ferrari also hosted a race, which would be dubbed the San Marino Grand Prix. The Spanish Grand Prix returned as a championship round after the 1980 edition had been excluded. In keeping with the event-sharing arrangement between the 2 circuits, the French Grand Prix was moved from Paul Ricard Circuit to Dijon Prix Noir. Likewise, the British Grand Prix was moved from Brands Hatch to Silverstone. The United States Grand Prix at Watkins Glen was originally scheduled for the 4th of October, but was cancelled due to the host's financial difficulties. It was replaced by the Caesars Palace Grand Prix, held in the Caesars Palace car park. For the first time, the survival cell was treated as an entity and an integral part of an F1 car. It had to extend in front of the driver's feet and wholly reinforced. The minimum weight of the car was raised from 575 kilograms to 585 kilograms. Tire barriers were installed at certain tracks for the first time. All pit lanes had to have a minimum width of 10 m. At the start of the race, drivers were placed on the grid in a 1x1x1 fashion, instead of a staggered 2x2 pattern. But let go now to discover a new epic, exciting and dramatic new Formula One season. The first of 2 rounds in the United States of America started a trilogy of F1 races in the Americas on March 15th at the Long Beach Street Circuit in Southern California, just outside the sprawling metropolis of Los Angeles. Goodyear had decided to withdraw from F1, leaving everyone on Michelin tires, and the cars were now running in new 1981 specification cars, with the sliding skirts now banned and cars required to have a 6 cm ground clearance in order to reduce downforce. Qualifying resulted in something of a surprise with Prix on pole in the Arrows with Jones and Reutemann behind him. Piquet was 4th with Villeneuve 5th, home favourite Andretti 6th and Mansell 7th. The top 10 was completed by Chiva, Giacomelli and Joria. The circuit had been slightly modified with the second left-hander on Pine Avenue made 1 fluid corner instead of 2 apexes. Race day had typically perfect Long Beach weather, and at the start Villeneuve made an amazing start and charged down to the first corner, Queen's hairpin, so quickly that he overshot, with Prix going into the lead with Jones and Reutemann chasing. In the middle of the pack, Prost and de Cesaris collided and both went out. Pironi made a remarkable start to go from 11th on the grid to 4th, ahead of Piquet, the recovering Villeneuve, Chiva, and Andretti. On the second lap Reutemann overtook Jones for second, but otherwise the top 6 remained unchanged until lap 17, when Pironi was able to pass Piquet for 4th, but on the next lap Villeneuve's Ferrari stopped with a driveshaft failure and so Chiva moved to 6th place. On lap 25 Prix began to suffer from fuel pressure problems and lost the lead to Reutemann. Prix soon headed for the pits, everyone moving up a place including Andretti, who took over 6th place. As Jones closed up on Reutemann, the Argentine driver made a mistake on Pine Avenue as he lapped Schura, going wide and Jones going ahead. On the same lap, Laffit overtook Andretti for 6th place and chased after Chiva. The two cars collided on lap 41, on Ocean Boulevard, and Laffite ended up in the pits. As Chiva began to drop back, Andretti was able to climb to 5th place, and on lap 54 that became 4th when Pironi slowed with an oil leak. Jones thus led another Williams 1-2 with Piquet 3rd, Andretti 4th, Chiva 5th, and Tambay 6th in the Theodore. The Formula One circus moved from North to South America to start a two-stop tour there. The first round was at the Jacarepagua Autodrome in Rio de Janeiro, only the second time F1 had been there. Tyrrell rented its second car to Zunino, but otherwise the field was exactly the same, although the new carbon fiber McLaren MP4's one which had been seen in Long Beach was not taken to South America. Jean-Pierre Jabouille tried to qualify the Talbot Ligier, but his legs were clearly not well enough healed from his accident in Montreal 6 months earlier. The car was handed over to Jean-Pierre Jabouille again. Lotus again ran into trouble with the twin-chassis Lotus 88, and there were murmurs about a new hydro-pneumatic suspension on the Brabhams which enabled the cars to be 6 centimeters off the ground when they were measured but much closer to the ground when they were out on the track. Pole position went to local hero Piquet in his Brabham with the two Williams cars of Reutemann and Jones behind him. 4th was Prix in the impressive Arrows, while Prost put his Renault 5th ahead of Bruno Giacomelli's Alfa Romeo, Villeneuve's Ferrari 126 CK, the second Renault of René Arnoux, Andretti's Alfa Romeo, and the Lotus 81B of De Angelis. It was wet on race morning and the start took place with the track damp but the rain holding off. Piquet decided to go on slick tyres, but everyone else except Didier Pironi and Siegfried Stoer decided to use wets. Prost made a bad start and this caused the fast-starting Villeneuve to have to lift off. Andretti hit the rear of Villeneuve and went over the Ferrari. Behind them Arnoux, Eddie Chiva, Stoer, and Chico Serra were all involved. At the front Reutemann went into the lead with Jones, Patrese, Giacomelli, De Angelis, and the rest in pursuit. In the early laps De Angelis overtook Giacomelli to take 4th place, and when Giacomelli spun off 5th place went to Keke Rosberg's Fittipaldi. John Watson made good progress from a poor grid position, and on lap 14 he overtook Rosberg for 4th. The Finn then dropped behind Jean-Pierre Jabouille as well. The order at the front remained unchanged until lap 29 when Jabouille went wide and dropped behind Marc Schurrer and Jacques Laffite. On lap 35 Watson spun as the rain increased, and so Schurrer moved to 5th with Laffite 6th. Schurrer's remarkable run went on, and on lap 49 he overtook De Angelis for 4th place, while behind him Jabouille repassed Laffite for 5th. In the closing laps the two Talbot Ligiers switched positions again, while Jones waited for Reutemann to move aside as the world champion was the team's number 1. Reutemann did not budge. The team showed pit boards indicating that Reutemann should move over, but he did not. Everyone thought he would be waiting for the last lap, but Reutemann took the flag first. Jones was furious and did not take part in the podium ceremony. Patrese finished 3rd with the remarkable Schurrer 4th ahead of the Talbot Ligiers. The other half of the South American Tour in Reutemann's home country of Argentina was usually held in January. This time it was in the cooler weather of April. Reutemann's decision to disobey team orders in Brazil had split the Williams team, while the Lotus 88 was once again banned. Team boss Colin Chapman was so incensed by the decision that he left before practice even began. There was also a dispute over Brabham's new hydro-pneumatic suspension, which was designed to overcome the regulation which meant cars had to run with 6 centimeters of ground clearance. Whenever the Brabham was measured it was 6 centimeters above the ground. The entry list was the same as in Brazil, except that Jabouille was back in the Talbot Ligier. He failed to qualify. Also missing out were the two Ocellas and Eliseo Salazar's March. Thanks to his hydro-pneumatic suspension system, Piquet was on pole position with Alain Prost second quickest in the Renault. Then came Jones and Reutemann, René Arnoux in the second Renault, and Hector Ribécu in the second Brabham. The top 10 was completed by Gilles Villeneuve, Ferrari, Keke Rosberg, Fittipaldi, Riccardo Patrese, Arrows, and Elio De Angelis in the Lotus. Race day came about, and at this varied circuit located in the Argentine capital of Buenos Aires, Jones took the lead at the start, but Piquet got ahead in the course of the first lap by driving around the outside of Jones in one of the corners, and he then drove away from the field. He ended the race over 25 seconds ahead. In the course of the second lap Reutemann overtook Jones, and the Australian would later drop behind Prost and Ribécu as well. Reback's Brabham was handling well, and so he was able to get ahead of the Renault on lap 11, and soon after he got past Reutemann, so for the middle part of the race the Brabhams were running in 1-2 formation. On lap 33, however, the Mexican disappeared with a distributor problem. This put Reutemann back into second place with Prost third and Jones fourth. Arnex finished fifth, while the final point went to De Angelis after a fight with Patrese and Patrick Tambay. Due to internal politics and the drivers' strike at the 1982 South African Grand Prix, the Argentine GP would not return to the calendar until 1995. Three weeks later, the GP circus returned to Europe to start the 4-month-long tour there, in Imola, Italy. Team Lotus had decided to miss the race, but in England a new Lotus 87 was being tested to replace the banned twin-chassis Lotus 88. The controversy over hydropneumatic suspensions had also faded, as all the cars now had systems fitted. The big excitement in the paddock was the appearance of the new Toleman F1 team, complete with a Brian Hart turbo engine and Pirelli tyres. Neither Brian Henton nor Derek Warwick qualified. Otherwise the entry list was little changed, although Tyrrell had replaced Ricardo Zunino with a rising star called Michel Alboreto, who brought much-needed backing for the team from a local ceramics company. News had emerged on Friday that the United States Grand Prix at Watkins Glen had been cancelled, although this was seen as predictable, given the historic circuit's financial troubles. Qualifying resulted in a popular pole position for Gilles Villeneuve in the turbocharged Ferrari. The Canadian was 7/10 ahead of Carlos Reutemann's Williams, while the Renaults of René Arnoux and Alain Prost filled the second row. Nelson Piquet was 5th and Ferrari's Didier Pironi 6th. The track was wet at the start and everyone was on wet tyres. This race turned out to be an exciting affair, as Villeneuve went into the lead while Pironi was able to use the prodigious power of the Ferrari to blast his way up to second position. At the back of the field there was a nasty accident when F1 debutant Miguel Angel Guerra had a moment in Tosa corner and was then hit by Eliseo Salazar's March. This punted the Osella into the barrier at high speed, and the Argentine driver had to be cut from the wreck with serious leg injuries. While Guerra was being released from his car, the two Ferraris ran away from the rest of the field, with Reutemann third, having driven into his teammate Jones to stop the Australian taking third on the first lap. This had damaged Jones's front wing and he was soon in the pits for repairs. That put Patrese up to 4th place, and he overtook Reutemann a few laps later as the Argentine went off over the grass at the final chicane. Piquet and his Brabham teammate Hector Ribécu completed the top 6 after Laffite and Arnoux had collided. On lap 14 Villeneuve went into the pits for slicks. As he accelerated away it started to rain again, and so 2 laps later Villeneuve was back in pit lane for wet tyres. Pironi led with Patrese second, while Piquet moved to third ahead of Reutemann. The Brazilian later got ahead of Patrese as well, and then started to race hard with Pironi. The top 5 remained unchanged until the 47th lap, when Piquet finally overtook Pironi, the Ferrari having damaged a skirt early on. Pironi drifted back behind Patrese, Reutemann and Ribécu, but he finished 5th, just ahead of Andrea de Cesaris's McLaren. In stark contrast to San Marino, the Belgian Grand Prix at Zolder was a shambolic event filled with tragedies and frustration. Politics dominated this event. Gordon Murray's hydraulic suspension gave his Brabhams a considerable performance advantage, and the teams had been heavily protesting the system's legality within the revised rules for the season. The political bickering over the Concord Agreement meant that with 32 entries, there were too many cars, and pressure was applied to ATS and Theodore to withdraw. ATS withdrew Jan Lammers but ran its second car for Slim Borgard, while Patrick Tambay was left without a drive. The Osella team had Piercarlo Ghinzani driving in place of the injured Miguel Angel Guerra. But the tragedy started with Carlos Reutemann accidentally running over an Osella mechanic, Giovanni Amadeo, who died of a fractured skull the Monday after the race. This accident led to complaints from the drivers about the congestion in the pits. Qualifying resulted in pole position for Reutemann, with Piquet second for Brabham and Pironi third in his turbocharged Ferrari. Fourth place went to Prix, with the top 10 being completed by Watson, Jones, Villeneuve, Cheever, Laffite, and Mansell. The race, however, was an appalling embarrassment by top motor racing standards. At the start, there was a driver's strike concerning mechanic and team personnel safety. They complained that their views were being ignored, which delayed the start. When the race started, an Arrows mechanic, Dave Luckett, jumped onto the grid just as the clerk of the course hit the lights to go green in an attempt to start Ricardo Patrese' stalled car. Luckett was run over by the other Arrows driver, Siegfried Stoer, and as Luckett laid sprawled unconscious on the track with broken legs, the marshals were able to get him off the track. The disorganization continued, as the drivers started their second lap with both Arrows cars still on the narrow start-to-finish straight. A number of marshals, protesting the clerk's dangerous decision, jumped onto the track, mere feet from the cars going at full racing speeds, and attempted to stop the race by waving at the drivers to stop, without the approval of the clerk of the course, who is the ultimate authority on the race's direction. The drivers continued on because they had not been shown the red flag by the clerk of the course, who is the only person at a Grand Prix who can show this flag. But by the time they were to start a third lap, the marshals succeeded in stopping the field themselves. In the meantime, Luckett was taken to hospital, and would survive. When the race restarted, neither Arrows took part. Pironi took the lead with Reutemann, Piquet, Watson, and Jones chasing him. The Australian looked very strong in the early laps as he passed Watson and Reutemann, and then Jones had a brush with Piquet which left the Brabham in the catch fencing. A furious Piquet charged up to Jones in the pits and attempted to physically fight him. On lap 12 he took the lead from Pironi, but 8 laps later the Williams jumped out of gear at Bianchebocht and smashed into the barriers. Piquet was fortunate to escape with a scalded thigh caused by water from a demolished radiator. This left Reutemann in the lead from Laffite and Mansell, Pironi having dropped back after going off. Watson was 4th with Villeneuve 5th and De Angelis 6th. It then started to rain, and the race was called off early at 75% distance, with Reutemann taking his last victory. In the closing laps Watson faded with gearbox trouble, and so Villeneuve finished 4th, De Angelis 5th and Cheever 6th. The historic Monaco Grand Prix was the scene of an ultra-exciting race. With too many cars entered, there had to be a pre-qualifying session to get the field down to 26 for practice. This eliminated both Tollmans, both Marches, and the single ATS of Slim Borgard. A further 6 were lost in qualifying, with Hector Ribecu, Rosberg and Chico Serra, Jabouille, and the 2 Osella all going home early. At the front of the grid, Piquet was on pole in his Brabham, with Villeneuve a remarkable second in this near-downforce absent Ferrari, and an impressive Mansell third in the new Lotus 87, which made its first appearance. Then came Reutemann, Patrese, De Angelis, Jones, Laffite, and Alain Prost. Watson completed the top 10 in the McLaren MP4-1. At the start there was the usual first corner accident as Andrea de Cesaris tangled with Mario Andretti's Alfa Romeo. Piquet took the lead with Villeneuve chasing and Mansell third ahead of the 2 Williams cars. The young Englishman disappeared early on with a suspension problem, and Reutemann went out with gearbox trouble, and Jones moved up ahead of Villeneuve and began to pressure Piquet for the lead. On lap 53 Piquet came up to lap some backmarkers, went offline, and slid off into a barrier at back. Jones took the lead and seemed to have the race in his pocket until lap 67, when he went into the pits with a fuel vaporization problem. He was soon on his way again, but Villeneuve saw his chance and began to close in. On lap 72 Villeneuve took the lead at Ste Devote. A disappointed Jones finished second with Laffite third, Pironi 4th, Eddie Cheever 5th and Mark Schurer 6th in the Ensign. 3 weeks after the Monaco Grand Prix, the narrow and tight Jarama circuit just outside Madrid was the location for the Spanish Grand Prix, and it produced one of the best races of the year. The field had altered somewhat with Eliseo Salazar having left March to join Ensign, displacing Marc Schurrer. Laffite took pole in his Ligia Matra with the 2 Williams DFBS of Jones and Reutemann second and third ahead of Watson, Prost, and the Alfa of Bruno Giacomelli. Villeneuve was 7th. Race day was incredibly hot. The temperature would be around 38 degrees Celsius when the race began, with Jones and Reutemann blasting into the lead as Laffite made a poor start with Villeneuve diving into third place at the first corner, snagging Prost's front wing as he took the place. At the end of the first lap, Villeneuve pulled out of Reutemann's slipstream and took second place. Jones quickly built a lead, but on lap 14, when he was around 10 seconds ahead, he went off at New Villari. This left Villeneuve in the lead with Reutemann on his tail. Behind them, Watson, Laffite and Elio De Angelis emerged from the hurly-burly and all began to close on the dueling leaders. Reutemann was having some trouble with his gearbox, and when Laffite arrived behind him there was little Reutemann could do to stop Jacques overtaking. The Argentine would later drop behind Watson, as well as the 5 front runners became a train of cars, nose to tail for the 18 laps of the race. Villeneuve had the power to get away from his rivals on the straight, but in the corners they were all over him. Time and time again Laffite pulled alongside as they emerged from a corner, but the Ferrari would surge ahead as the horsepower kicked in. Villeneuve, Jacques Laffite, John Watson, Reutemann and Elio De Angelis remained locked together right to the flag, crossing the line covered by just 1.24s to record the second closest race in the history of F1 at the time. Villeneuve, in a powerful but very ill-handling Ferrari, managed to keep for better handling cars behind him in a car that was badly suited to the slow, narrow and twisty Jarama circuit. The small crowd, the inappropriate time of year this race was held in and the waning interest of the organizers caused this race to be the last Spanish Grand Prix until 1986, when it was moved south to the new Jerez circuit near Seville. Two weeks after Gilles Villeneuve's extraordinary victory in Spain, the alternating French Grand Prix moved from the Paul Ricard circuit near Marseille to the fast, sweeping Prix circuit near Dijon, located in the Burgundy countryside, where the F1 gathered with Carlos Reutemann well ahead of Nelson Piquet in the World Championship. Marc Schurrer had taken over the Theodore drive, leaving Patrick Tambay out of work. However, Jabouille had decided to retire as he was no longer competitive as a result of the leg injuries he had suffered in Canada in 1980, and so Tambay became the second Talbot Ligier driver. This was perfect as it reduced the field to 30 cars and meant that there was no need for pre-qualifying. The other news was that Goodyear had returned to F1, and so Williams and Brabham appeared on Goodyear tires, while Ensign and March used Avon. Qualifying resulted in pole position for Arnox's Renault. This was not a surprise, but second place for Watson's McLaren MP FUD1 was rather startling, particularly as the Marlboro car was ahead of the second Renault driven by Prost. Fourth place went to Piquet with Andrea de Cesaris, Laffite, Reutemann, De Angelis, Jones and Mario Andretti completing the top 10. On the first lap, Piquet took the lead from Watson, Prost, de Cesaris and Villeneuve, while Arnoux dropped back to 9th. Prost soon moved ahead of Watson, while further back de Cesaris was pushed behind Villeneuve, although both men were then overtaken by Reutemann. Arnoux recovered to run 5th and he moved up to 4th ahead of Reutemann on lap 33, only to run into trouble and drop back behind the Argentine driver. On lap 58 there was a torrential downpour and the race was stopped. The weather cleared up quickly, and so it was decided that the second part of the race would be run with a grid based on the finishing order of the first part. This time Piquet was engulfed by Prost's Renault and he was followed ahead by Watson and Arnoux. Piquet faded quickly behind Pironi and any advantage he had had in the first part of the race disappeared. Prost stayed ahead all the way to the flag to win his first of 51 F1 victories at home in a Renault, and he was followed home by Watson. Piquet was given third place while the remaining points went to Arnoux, Pironi and De Angelis. The British Grand Prix was held at the flat Silverstone circuit this year, which was the fastest Grand Prix circuit in the world at the time. The field was almost the same as at Dijon 2 weeks earlier, except that Jean-Pierre Jorier had been hired to drive for Osella in place of Miguel Angel Guerra. Team Lotus appeared with the Lotus 88B, but once again the team ran into trouble with FISA over the legality of the car, and eventually the cars were disqualified. As they had been built by cannibalizing the 87s, the team had no choice but to withdraw. Qualifying resulted in a 1-2 for the Renaults of Arnoux and Prost, with Nelson Piquet third in his Brabham. The Brazilian used a new BMW turbo engine BT50 in the course of practice but set his time in the old BT49C. Pironi was fourth fastest for Ferrari, and then came the two McLarens of Watson and de Cesaris. The fourth row featured Jones alongside Villeneuve's Ferrari, while the top 10 was completed by Reutemann and Prix. Race day was on a Saturday, and at the start Prost walked away from the field. At the start of lap 5, near the Woodcut chicane, Villeneuve lost control, taking out Alan Jones and Andrea de Cesaris, who were both unable to avoid the Canadian, while Briton John Watson, in the other McLaren, narrowly missed the wreckage. Villeneuve managed to get the Ferrari going again, but only got as far as Stowe Corner before parking. On lap 12, Nelson Piquet, who was third at that point, crashed his Brabham at Beckett's and had to be carried by an ambulance due to leg injuries. Later in the race, Prost was forced to pit due to problems with an engine plug that could not be replaced without dismantling much of the car, forcing the Frenchman to retire and leaving his teammate, Arnoux, in the lead. Watson was now fighting back, and after being delayed by the Villeneuve-Jones incident, he overtook Reutemann and Andretti, and closed on Pironi. As he overtook the Ferrari, it blew up and went out, and so Watson was a safe third with only the two Renault drivers ahead. On the 17th lap Prost's engine blew, but Arnoux remained firmly ahead with Watson second, Reutemann third, Andretti fourth, Prix fifth and Hector Ribécu sixth. Prix soon moved ahead of Andretti while Ribécu dropped down the order when he stopped for new tyres, Laffite moving into sixth place. The order was then settled until the 50th lap, when the Renault engine began to sound odd and Watson began to close up quickly. On the 60th lap he went ahead. At the same moment Andretti disappeared with a throttle cable failure, and as Arnoux faded through the field, Prix went out with an engine failure. This meant that the final order was Watson taking victory, with Reutemann, Laffite, Eddie Cheever, Ribécu, and Slim Borgard rounding out the points. The German Grand Prix at the very fast, straight-dominated Hockenheimring saw the field being unchanged, apart from the fact that Team Lotus was back in action with a pair of Lotus 87s, both sporting new JPS sponsorship. There were some changes of tyres, with Tyrrell running on Avons, Lotus on Goodyear and Arrows on Pirellis. It was no surprise to see the two Renault turbo cars on the front row, with Prost nearly half a second quicker than Arnoux. World Championship leader Reutemann was third with his Williams teammate Jones fourth. Pironi was fifth in his Ferrari, and Piquet was sixth in his Brabham, apparently without any problems from his Silverstone accident, while the top 10 was completed by Laffite, Villeneuve, and the two McLarens of Watson and de Cesaris. The race turned out to be a classic, and at the start Prost took the lead, but Reutemann managed to get ahead of Arnoux. On the run down to the first chicane, Pironi also went past Arnoux, and Piquet tried the same at the Ost curve. The Renault and the Brabham touched. This meant that Arnoux had to pit at the end of the lap with a deflated right rear. While this was going on, Jones went past Piquet. Halfway around the second lap, Pironi disappeared with a blown engine, with Prost leading over Reutemann, Jones, Piquet, Laffite, Villeneuve and Patrick Tambay. Villeneuve soon dropped away, but Jones was in combative form and was challenging Prost for the lead in a superb battle. Behind them, Piquet had overtaken Reutemann and was closing up. The fight for the lead was soon between the three cars. But Piquet's tyres, improperly worn from his Brabham suffering bodywork damage, could not take the pace, and he dropped back behind Reutemann. On lap 21, Jones finally managed to get ahead of Prost in the stadium when they were lapping Arnoux. Behind the top 5, Piquet had moved into 6th, but this became 5th when Reutemann stopped on lap 28 with an engine failure. At 2/3 distance, rain began to fall, and as the Renault became more difficult to control, Piquet was able to take 2nd from Prost. Jones's car then began to misfire, and soon Piquet and Prost were both ahead. Jones headed for the pits. Piquet thus inherited victory, with Prost 2nd, Laffite 3rd and Piquet 4th. Eddie Cheever was 5th with Watson 6th. When F1 descended upon the fast and sweeping Osterreichring, the entry was as normal, except that the Fittipaldi team, which was struggling for money, was not present because it did not have enough engines. Tyrrell had switched from Avon tyres to Goodyear. Eddie Cheever would fail to make the grid in the new Tyrrell 011. With Austria's extra altitude, the turbocharged cars were at an advantage, so Arnoux and Prost put their Renaults on the front row, with Villeneuve's Ferrari 3rd. Laffite was next up in the Talbot Ligier, while Williams teammates Carlos Reutemann and Alan Jones were 5th and 6th. The top 10 was completed by Nelson Piquet, Didier Pironi, Elio De Angelis, and Riccardo Patrese. At the start, Villeneuve blasted his Ferrari into the lead ahead of Prost, Arnoux and Pironi. Villeneuve pushed too hard on the second lap and went off at the chicane, rejoining in 6th place. This left Prost and Arnoux to pull away, while Pironi's Ferrari provided a roadblock for those chasing. The cork stayed in the bottle until the 9th lap, by which time 7 cars were stuck behind the Renaults, which had a lead of nearly 20 seconds. Pironi's Ferrari was quicker in the straights, but the car's severe lack of downforce compared to the others meant it was noticeably slower through the Osterreichring's high-speed sweepers. Villeneuve crashed heavily at the Bosch curve, while Laffite made it through with a very brave pass at the first panorama curve, and he was followed by Piquet. Laffite began to close up, but then the gap stabilized. Pironi dropped back behind the two Williams cars, Jones still leading Reutemann. By mid-distance, Laffite was within striking distance of the Renaults before Prost suffered a suspension failure and went out, allowing Arnoux to take the lead. On lap 39, Laffite finally managed to get ahead as the pair diced through traffic. Arnoux had to settle for second while third went to Piquet. Jones and Reutemann were fourth and fifth, and the final point went to John Watson. The Fittipaldi team was back in action for the Dutch GP at the Zandvoort circuit near Amsterdam after missing the Austrian GP but had switched to Pirelli tyres. Otherwise the field was the same as usual, and it was an all-Renault front row with Alain Prost out-qualifying René Arnoux. Third place went to World Championship challenger Piquet with his rival Reutemann fifth, behind his Williams teammate Jones. Laffite was sixth in his Talbot Ligier just ahead of Andretti, Watson, De Angelis, and Patrese. Andrea de Cesaris qualified 13th but was withdrawn because the team was worried that he would damage another car, his season with the team having seen a string of accidents. The Italian de Cesaris, although quick, was horrendously erratic. He ended up crashing no less than 19 times this season, including 8 times during a race, and even more remarkably without injuring himself once. At the start Prost and Arnoux went into Tarzan ahead, but behind them Gilles Villeneuve tried to make up for his poor qualifying and charged through a gap between Patrese and Bruno Giacomelli's Alfa Romeo. Giacomelli was unaware that Villeneuve was there, and the result was that Villeneuve ran into the Alfa, vaulted over it and landed, spinning. At the next corner Andretti and Reutemann collided and the American ended up with a bent front wing. Also in trouble were Pironi and Tambay, the pair having collided in the course of the first lap. This left Prost leading Arnoux and Jones, with Piquet 4th, Laffite 5th and Reutemann 6th. In the opening laps Jones went ahead of Arnoux and the Frenchman soon dropped behind Piquet and Laffite as well. By the 10th lap Reutemann too was clear of Arnoux, and a couple of laps later Watson drove around the outside of Arnoux at Tarzan to take 6th place. The order at the front remained unchanged, but Jones was beginning to challenge Prost. Behind these two there was another lively battle for 4th between Laffite and Reutemann. This ended on lap 18 with the pair colliding. Jones tried to pass Prost on several occasions, but then his tyres became marginal and he dropped away. In the closing laps he fell into the clutches of Piquet and lost second place. Hector Ribecu gave Brabham 4th place after a steady run, with the other points going to De Angelis and Eliseo Salazar in the Ensign, one of the few men still running, albeit 2 laps down. Piquet's second place meant that he was equal on points with Reutemann. The second Italian and last European race of the year, the Italian Grand Prix, returned to the historic Monza circuit just outside Milan after a year's stay at Imola. Nelson Piquet and Carlos Reutemann arrived on equal points in the World Championship, and the summer had been seen the emergence as a major force of Alain Prost in the Renault, and he too was becoming the threat to the World Championship leaders. The switching around of tyres continued, with Tyrrell deciding to go back to Goodyear at least for Eddie Cheever's car. The field was the same as usual, with Arnoux on pole in the Renault ahead of Reutemann's Williams and Prost. Laffite was 4th in his Ligier and he was clear of Jones, who had arrived in Italy after being physically beaten up by 5 men in London, and Piquet, while the top 10 was completed by Watson, Pironi and Villeneuve in the powerful but evil-handling Ferraris and Giacomelli's Alfa Romeo. The event was significant in that it marked the first start for the Toleman team, Brian Henton having finally qualified one of the Toleman hard cars in 23rd position on the grid after a season of disappointment. At the start Pironi made an exceptional start and he was 4th at the first chicane behind Prost, Reutemann and Arnoux. By the time the field arrived on the back straight, Pironi was second. It did not last long. Arnoux moved to second on the 5th lap, and on lap 6 Laffite went to third. Villeneuve followed him but disappeared with turbo failure soon afterwards. Then Laffite began to drop back with a slow puncture and it began to rain. Jack went off. This left the 2 Renaults and the 2 Williams cars ahead, but with a gap between them. Arnoux then went off at the Parabolica, swerving to avoid Eddie Cheever's abandoned Tyrrell, and so Prost was left on his own. There was then a huge accident at the Lesmo when Watson lost control of his MP41. It spun into the barriers and the engine was ripped from the tub. Watson emerged unhurt, but the engine went across the road, causing Michel Alboreto to crash his Tyrrell. The next to arrive was Reutemann, and he had to take to the grass, and so he dropped behind Jacarepagua. The Alfa driver was not in luck, however, and on lap 26 his Alfa went into the pits with his gearbox jammed. This put Piquet into third place behind Prost and Jones, and it looked like staying that way until the last lap when his engine blew, which allowed Reutemann, De Angelis and Pironi to pass him. He picked up just 1 point and Reutemann moved 3 points ahead in the World Championship. The season concluded with 2 races in North America, the first of these being in Montreal, Canada. Alan Jones announced that he was retiring for Formula One, and there were rumors that Mario Andretti would do the same. At the same time, Niki Lauda was spotted testing one of the new McLaren MP41s at Donington Park, and it looked like he would be making a comeback. Siegfried Stoer, after his trauma in Belgium and the uncompetitiveness of the Arrows, then decided that he no longer wanted to be an F1 driver, and a deal was struck for Ricardo Patrese to be partnered in Canada by Gilles Villeneuve's brother Jacques Villeneuve. Qualifying resulted in pole position for Piquet with his title rival Reutemann alongside. Jones was third while Prost was fourth in his Renault. The weather had turned cold and wet by race day, and at the start Jones took the lead after banging wheels with Reutemann. The Argentine driver had to lift off and he was overtaken by rival Piquet, Prost and De Angelis. Further back, Villeneuve tipped Arnoux into a spin, the Renault bashing into Pironi's Ferrari as it went off. In the laps that followed, Villeneuve moved up to take third on lap 7 when Jones spun and Piquet dropped back as he tried to avoid the Williams. This let Prost take the lead with Laffite second. Watson moved to fourth and things began to settle down until lap 13 when Laffite moved into the lead. He was followed through into second place a few laps later by Villeneuve, and as Prost faded further he fell behind Watson as well. Watson was then able to catch and pass Villeneuve as well, with the race finishing in that order. Fourth place ended up going to Bruno Giacomelli, fifth to Piquet and sixth to De Angelis. Piquet's 2 points mean that he and Reutemann headed to Las Vegas separated by a point, while Laffite had an outside chance of winning the title. The Watkins Glen circuit in the state of New York was removed from the calendar in May due to bankruptcy of the company operating the circuit, resulting in a 3-week-long gap between the Canadian Grand Prix and the new Caesars Palace Grand Prix, at a circuit located in a car park outside of the Caesars Palace Hotel and Casino Complex in Las Vegas, Nevada. During this time frame, Niki Lauda announced his decision to return to F1 with McLaren in 1982. Many in the F1 paddock were confused and unhappy to be racing around the car park of a Las Vegas casino. World Championship leader Carlos Reutemann qualified on pole ahead of his teammate Alan Jones. The Australian had no intent to do anything to help the Argentine to the title because of their clash over team orders at the start of the year. He was retiring from F1 after the race and had nothing to lose whilst prioritizing a victory. Third on the grid was Gilles Villeneuve in the Ferrari, with Reutemann's title rival Nelson Piquet fourth, Alain Prost fifth in his Renault and John Watson sixth in the McLaren. In dry, 24 degrees Celsius conditions, Jones took the lead at the start with Reutemann dropping behind Villeneuve, Prost and Giacomelli before the first corner, while Piquet was eighth. With Villeneuve holding up those behind, Jones drove to an unchallenged victory. Prost overtook Villeneuve on lap 3, but his Renault was not as fast as Jones' Williams. On the next lap Laffite overtook Watson and the order then stabilized with Piquet running behind Reutemann, both men out of the points. On lap 17 Piquet passed the subdued Reutemann and he was followed by Andretti. Piquet chased after Watson and took 6th place on lap 22. This was briefly 5th when Villeneuve stopped with a fuel injection problem. But Nelson was then overtaken by Andretti. A few moments later, Giacomelli's promising run in 4th place ended when he went off and rejoined back in 9th position, with Piquet was back in 5th, but when Reutemann overtook Watson for 6th, the pair were back on equal points. Andretti retired with a broken rear suspension as Piquet moved to 4th and Reutemann to 5th. Soon afterwards, Prost pitted for tyres and dropped to 6th, but at the same time Mansell went ahead of Reutemann, and as Prost recovered, the Argentine lost another place. Prost's recovery would take him to 2nd place, while Reutemann's unimpressive afternoon continued as he drifted behind the recovering Giacomelli. Piquet got up to 3rd when Laffite went in for tyres, but he was then overtaken by Mansell and Giacomelli, the Italian moving up to 3rd in the closing laps. Jones would win the first Caesars Palace Grand Prix, ahead of Prost, Giacomelli, Mansell, Piquet and Laffite. With Reutemann out of the points, Piquet's 5th place was enough to win his first of 3 World Championship titles.